The story of the last few days in college sports has been the agreement, the settling of lawsuits between Florida State, Clemson, and on the other side, the ACC, and on the precipice, on the cutting edge of all of that reporting, Andrea Adelson, ACC reporter for ESPN. You can follow her on Twitter or X at A. Adelson ESPN. She is now joining us on the Hubert Automotive Group hotline. Andrea, thank you for taking the time. I think it's obvious when at least from my understanding of it all, why Clemson and Florida State would agree to settle the lawsuits with all of these new structures. Why did the ACC as a conference agree to lower the exit fees and agree to disproportionate payouts and everything else in this agreement? Did they get something back in return?
Well, they got stability for the conference in the near term anyway. And so when you think about what's happened over the last 24 months, this is a conference that, quite frankly, has been in turmoil with the lawsuits that Florida State and Clemson filed against the conference and this cloud hanging over the league, not knowing whether they were going to bolt or what was going to happen in court and whether they'd be able to keep everyone together, for the next year. And so I think the members that voted for this, and remember, the 18 schools had a vote for this. It wasn't Jim Phillips unilaterally deciding. All the member schools had a say and had a vote. And that vote was held yesterday. I think for them, this notion that, we're going to lower the exit fee, but it lowers for everybody, right? Not just Florida State and Clemson. There are other schools in the conference that maybe didn't file lawsuits, but certainly were pondering what that exit fee should look like and what the future may look like at some point down the line that are going to benefit from this. A lot of schools that are going to benefit from a viewership standpoint in terms of getting more money with the new revenue distribution model. But when it comes to the exit fee, I think there was this sense among the schools in the league that they wanted the lawsuits to come to an end. They didn't want that to be playing out in court over the next years and years, particularly without any certainty about how it was all going to play out. What if you lose in court, right? So this is a way to kind of settle all that, end it, bring about some stability. And quite frankly, we don't know what the landscape is going to look like once this exit fee lowers in 2030. Nobody has any idea. And so if you're the schools that voted for this, you could maybe stand to benefit from it, or there may be an entirely new model altogether for college football or for collegiate athletics that hasn't even begun to be fathomed because of all the changes that we have seen over the last year, 2 years, 5 years. So in all, I think the league and the member schools felt like this is a win for them too, because now people will stop asking, at least in the short term, is the ACC going to survive this? Right now, over the next 5 years, it appears anyway that this conference is going to survive it with Florida State and Clemson on board.
Andrea Adelson, ACC reporter for ESPN, connecting on the Hubert Automotive Group hotline. If the near-term stability is there, do you get the feeling or is there any indication that maybe 2030 becomes the planned exit date for some of these key schools and that just gives them 4 or 5 years to plan their escape route?
I don't know. I don't think anybody can say for certain what 2030 is going to look like. We don't know what the television market is going to look like when it comes to the valuation of the Big Ten and their new contract. The Big 12 contract is going to be up, and so is the college football playoff contract. So nobody knows what that's going to look like. That's number one. Number two, nobody really knows what the collegiate landscape is going to look like, particularly now that football is moving more toward a semi-pro NFL-style model. When you look at revenue share that's coming, when you look at this idea that remains that athletes should be employees, when you think about Congress potentially getting involved into what this is going to look like, we don't know if college football is even going to remain under the auspices of the conferences that they're now. What if there's a football breaks away and there's a super league only for football? These are all things that need to be thought about and considered. I don't necessarily know that realignment, the way that we've seen it, that has forced a lot of these changes, is going to look exactly the same in 2030. I don't know how Florida State's going to look in 2030. I don't know how Clemson's going to look in 2030, right? I mean, we're all sitting here projecting out based on what has happened in the past with realignment and thinking, oh, it's just going to be the same exact thing. But in the past with realignment, we haven't had revenue share. We haven't had some of these provisions that the NCAA held so strongly to stripped away and given more power to the athletes. So I think it's going to look different. I really do. And so that's why I say I don't know. I mean, I talked to people at Florida State who have said to me, we could be in the ACC forever. We don't know. And that's the thing. It's too early to sit here and say, well, absolutely, the league is going to break apart in 2030. How does anybody even know that? Nobody does, because we don't even know what the landscape is going to look like.
Is there any concern that it makes it too difficult or nearly impossible for maybe the have-nots to climb the ACC and get in the mix? Because, I mean, there's already so many advantages for schools, the ones we've mentioned, the Florida States, the Clemsons, UNCs, Miamis. Now that you could get a lesser payout to some of these more have-not schools, are they ever going to have a chance to compete for like a football conference championship with so many disadvantages?
Well, I mean, you could say that Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, and Clemson have already had advantages in that they've funded their football programs completely differently than some other programs. And yet Wake Forest, as recently as a few years ago, played for an ACC championship, right? So Pitt has won an ACC championship, maybe not funded the same way as Florida State or Clemson. Look at SMU coming in without any money at all. And playing for an ACC championship. So I think what this does is it incentivizes athletic departments and programs to invest even more in football, because if you do that, you can get a greater return on your investment, not just potentially with better games and better time slots, therefore better viewership, which will help you with that revenue distribution change. But the success initiatives are huge, right? If you are good in football, men's and women's basketball, and you've invested in those and you can be good and have that success, well, you get more money there. So I'll give you SMU as another example. They come in here, they take $0 from the ACC, and yet they're going to make more from the success initiatives than Florida State will from a football perspective because they won and they made the playoff, right? So I still think that, yes, will it be harder? Sure. Obviously, it's going to be harder if you're not getting that equal payout from the television perspective that you've always gotten, or the equal payout that you've always gotten up until this past year. Yes, that'll make things harder. And yes, you're going to have to find different ways to fundraise to try and make up for some of that. But the word that I have heard used, not just from Florida State and Clemson, but from others in the entire ACC. And the ACC itself is it's incentivizing schools now to be able to invest so they can make more money on the back end of it. Because let's say you're number one in viewership, right? With Georgia Tech. Would Georgia Tech fit in a different category than Florida State, Clemson, and Miami from a funding perspective? Well, yeah. Historically, yes. Well, Georgia Tech was the number one rated school in the ACC last year. And yeah, they had some favorable time slots playing Florida State in week 0 and Georgia on a Friday night. But they took advantage of that by playing well in both of those games. So I think there's ways that you can do it, but it is harder. I think there are ways, though.
Andrea Adelson, ACC reporter for ESPN. Andrea, before we let you go, we're here in the Triangle in North Carolina, where college basketball means a ton here. You brought up men's and women's basketball. How much does basketball matter in the future of the ACC, even if we acknowledge football as king? Yeah,
it matters because you can't have 3 teams make the tournament. I mean, you just can't if you're the ACC, right? I mean, what would you have said if I told you 5 years ago the ACC was only going to get 3 teams in the NCAA tournament? You'd have been like, did the league fall apart?
Exactly. I probably would have assumed there was realignment and all the teams I expected in the ACC weren't there.
Exactly. So there's no question men's basketball has to be fixed. Now, obviously, there are some extenuating circumstances here, right? I mean, coach turnover, Hall of Fame coach turnover. That's big. But I also think, there's been so much of an emphasis on investment in football, right? That maybe some of that money went to football, maybe not as much as traditionally went to men's basketball. Well, now schools have to figure out how to fix that, right? Because men's basketball success, women's basketball success, that's included in the success initiatives. And men's basketball viewership is also included in the new revenue distribution with the brand initiative, right? So you have to figure out ways to be able to get that fixed. I mean, this is still a league that should care about men's basketball, even though all the money is coming from football. So, yes, I think it's hugely important moving forward that the ACC figures out a way to get this fixed, because once again, you've already ceded ground to the SEC and the Big Ten in football. You've kind of accepted that. It's hard to accept that in men's basketball for a tradition-heavy conference in men's basketball. So I do think it's really important, even though football is the revenue generator.
Andrea, I appreciate you for taking the time. The reporting that you and your colleague David Hale have done at ESPN, it's where I've gotten all my information on this story. So I appreciate you for jumping on the show, and hopefully we're able to do it again soon.
Well, thanks for the kind words, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about it.